So a couple more things I want to add before ending this lecture, and that's how do you make all of these units different? There's a huge difference between a refrigerator in your kitchen and cooling a warehouse. A lot of that is just a matter of size, refrigerant choice, the pressures you're dealing with. And in both cases, you're just cooling the air in a room and anything that's in that room. But what if you wanted to do other things? What if you wanted to make shaved ice? What if you wanted to make ice cubes? What if you wanted to keep specimens cold in a science lab? You wanted to make a freezer for I don't know, embryos that you're keeping in a research facility. Whatever you're doing, you have a design criteria. What is the ambient temperature in the room? What is the cooled temperature you need inside of the cooling unit? How big is the space you're cooling? And really the business end is the evaporator. That's what's inside the refrigerator or the freezer. So if I want to make ice cubes, I just need to design the evaporator in such a way that I can freeze water in little trays. And it can be handy if I'm trying to do it efficiently. It can be handy to design the evaporator in a way that is going to help me make my block ice, my shaved ice, my cold lettuce, whatever I'm trying to keep cold. The evaporator is the business end. The evaporator is what you need to design specifically to your product. The rest of the system is just about size and temperature differences. How big a space am I cooling? How cold do I need to get it? What are the moisture issues I'm dealing with? There are lots of engineering considerations. But when you're trying to develop a refrigeration unit for specific tasks, the real engineering change, the real business end, as I said, is the evaporator. But I also want to mention before I leave here, what about that comment I made earlier about using water as a refrigerant? How can you do that? Well, you don't use water as a refrigerant in a heat pump refrigeration system like we have here. But I can take anything that is wet and stick it in a box that is capable of having the air removed to create a vacuum. And what's going to happen when I pull a vacuum on that? If I pull a strong enough vacuum, the water will boil. And if I pull a strong enough vacuum long enough, I can get that water to freeze. It will boil to the point where it freezes. And that will damage your product if I've got lettuce or something. So what do? I can take cartons of heads of lettuce from the field, stick them in a bunch of boxes. Now the boxes have to have holes in them. You don't see holes on the ends here, but I'm sure there are holes on the sides or this wouldn't work. And you put the lettuce in there, close the door, pull a vacuum. And when you pull the vacuum, the water that's in between the leaves of a head of iceberg lettuce will start to boil. As it's boiling, it gets colder. And so what does the operator of this vacuum cooler unit need to do? They need to know how much lettuce are they putting in, how many pounds of lettuce, possibly some of the configuration of that lettuce, if it's really hard, over mature, under mature, big heads, small heads, that can make a slight difference as well. but mostly it's how many pounds of lettuce am I putting in, and what is the starting temperature of that lettuce? And I want to cool it down to about 34. If I hit 32, that's really dangerous. I hit 31, boom, I froze it. At 32, you're right on the knife edge. You might not freeze it, but 34 is the sweet spot. You haven't frozen it for sure. You haven't done any frost damage, but you've cooled that lettuce, because as all that water inside the lettuce boils, it gets colder and colder and colder and colder until boom, you're done. You take it out of the tube and put it in a refrigerated warehouse or a refrigerated truck. So it's already down at 34 in the room. So the temperature of the lettuce is brought down to the temperature of the room or the truck it's going to be placed in. And it can hold that temperature for quite a length of time. But what did I just say we're doing? We're using water on the lettuce to boil. All that weight of water that we could have sold a head of lettuce, pounds of water is pounds of lettuce. As I boil away the water, I'm boiling away money. But that's okay. You're not losing that much. And there's quite a bit of water in between the leaves of a head of lettuce. The way crisp head lettuce forms a head, or iceberg lettuce, if you prefer. Iceberg is actually a variety from way back, I think from the 1930s or something. Iceberg from New York. Now we're the lettuce capital of the world, but iceberg is a variety. Crisp head is the actual type. We're not losing that much because there's so much water in there. Plenty to boil, and it won't hurt the lettuce. Crisp head lettuce is very firm, very rigid, very crunchy, with plenty of water between the leaves that are, they're not so tight that when you pull a vacuum, the water in the inside of the head can't get out. It can get out. When you pull a vacuum on the outside of the head, that vacuum goes all the way to the inside because it's not solid. But iceberg lettuce or crisp head lettuce is really the only product that can handle that. If I were to put spinach in that vacuum cooler, what's going to happen? What water is there to boil? The water inside the cells of that spinach leaf. And you're going to boil off water from inside the cells. Now, most products aren't going to damage the cells. The water can boil in a very slow or very controlled way and come out as vapor through the pores in the leaves without damaging the leaf directly. But some of the cells might burst. What's really a problem is that you're losing water at all. And the spinach is going to come out limp. The amount of water required to boil off is going to cause that beautiful spinach, that nice, firm, fresh looking, happy spinach to be limp. And that's the same for butterhead lettuce. That's the same for romaine lettuce. Anything that is considered a leafy or open style lettuce, even some sort of head lettuce like butterhead or some of those, they're too delicate. But there's a simple process. It's called a hydrovac. And it uses the same exact vacuum cooling principle that I just mentioned. You put the lettuce inside a chamber, close the door, draw a vacuum, it cools it. The only difference with hydrovac is along the ceiling of the hydrovac unit, you have sprinklers. And so you put the lettuce in, the romaine lettuce, the spinach, or whatever else you're cooling, and you run the sprinklers, sending pre-chilled water that's already really cold, so you're not wasting any energy doing that. You've got a tank of really not super chilled, but cold water that's somewhere in the 30s, maybe 40, but it's cold. And so you sprinkle that water, not a whole lot, but you sprinkle it over the cartons. And so you need waxed cartons or plastic cartons that can handle that. You can pack iceberg lettuce, crisp head lettuce, in regular cardboard boxes, but you'll notice that a lot of the other produce, the other leafy greens, come in wax boxes. Why? They're going to sprinkle it as they cool it. So they're going to sprinkle it first, turn off the sprinklers, and then draw the vacuum. Which water is going to boil? Not the water that's inside the cells of the leaves, but the water that you just sprinkled on the outside of the leaves. So now the product is kind of wet. You draw the vacuum, that water that's on the surface boils, cools it down as it boils. And if you get your numbers right, you know the right pressure to pull and how long to leave it at that pressure, or vacuum, lack of pressure. You know how hard a vacuum to pull and how long to pull it. You can get the product down to the right temperature so it's right around 34 degrees, the sweet spot for leafy greens. And leafy greens, they're not real thick, they're not real dense. Even crisp head lettuce doesn't have a high respiration or cellular breathing rate, cellular respiration rate. So they can hold pretty dang well. You stick it in a refrigerator and it will be just fine. There's an added problem with certain products, and probably the most notable for this area is broccoli. Broccoli is thick, and broccoli is biologically very active. So when a head of broccoli is cooled down to 34 degrees, that'll slow it down, but it takes a lot of energy. You can't do it in a vacuum cooler. It's just too dense, too thick. Those big, thick stems, it just won't work in a vacuum. So you have to use super chilled water, and you literally put it under a waterfall of super chilled water. Sometimes you add salt to that water to have the water at a temperature even below normal freshwater freezing. Really cool off that broccoli. But now that the broccoli's cooled, it's biologically still active. It doesn't slow down as much as the leafy greens. So now the cells are still doing their thing. The cells are still alive. They're still respiring. And when cells burn energy, it creates heat. After I've already cooled it, it starts warming back up. They're not warm-blooded, they don't have blood, but they will warm back up. And in some cases, if you've got a big pallet of broccoli, it can warm back up sufficiently to ruin the whole pallet from the inside out with heat that builds up from the center out. So with broccoli, we have to do something else. We have to use a water shower to chill them. And then we might have to, if it's going to be packed and transported longer distances, we might have to put that broccoli on ice. So they do ice injectors. And we'll talk about that. I'll show you some videos later. But they literally take shaved, super cooled ice and they blow it in through some holes with some water. The water drains out, the super chilled water drains out. The water just helps carry that ice into the center of the cartons. And after you're done cooling it and then ice injecting it, any biological activity that might raise the temperature is going to go into melting the ice and not making it hotter inside the boxes. And that buys you quite a bit of transportation time. And then you break down the pallets and then the heat isn't building up inside a pallet anymore. So broccoli has its own challenges. Again, using different knowledge of your crop, different knowledge of basic physics, you can use a heat pump as a refrigeration system. You can use a heat pump to cool water or make ice. You can use a heat pump for lots of different things. Or you can use a vacuum cooler for iceberg lettuce. Or you can use a combination of vacuum plus a heat pump chilled water to sprinkle heat pump chilled water onto your spinach or romaine and use a hydrovac, a combination of heat pump chilled water sprinkled onto the product that is then vacuum cooled, hydrovac. Okay, so that's the basics of refrigeration.